Welcome to another evening of Zen Talk, the Atlanta Soda Zen Center. Please check out our website at ascc.org for our overall program of activities. Each week we have this Zen Talk program where typically what we do is interview somebody about their practice, how they came to Zen in the first place and why they keep coming back. And this evening, going to do something a little different. We're going to not interview, but pay respect to Matsuo Roshi as our virtual guest this evening. You can't see him, but I can. And this evening, we will entertain questions from the audience about Zen, all the things you've always wanted to know about Zen, but perhaps were afraid to ask. And I will do my best to respond to those questions. It's a little bit like what is called Mondo, means crossing of swords, or a public dokusan. Dokusan is a private interview typically. But in the old days, there was a situation where, in one case, one great teacher in China had over 5,000 monks, over 5,000 followers, monks and nuns. And so they had this logistical problem, the logistical issue of how to expose everyone to this abbot's teaching. And so the story goes, they decided to sort of trot him out on a dais platform outside, and everybody would gather in the field. And one hardy, perhaps foolhardy individual would come up and ask a question, and he would respond. And so everybody would observe. And Dokusan apparently was not that different for Dogen, who went to China in the 13th century, around 1225, somewhere around there. He was born in 1200, so he was in his mid-20s. And apparently, according to the story, Nyojo Rujing, his teacher, his Chinese teacher, would give Dokusan outside, and he would be sitting in a bamboo screen, a U-shaped screen, another larger U-shaped screen around him, so that an individual monk would enter. And you have to picture this as kind of like a maze. You enter in here and come in, bow, and ask your questions, and Rujing would respond. And then the monk would leave and another monk would come in. So the monks who were were waiting around outside the outer U-shaped screen. So they could hear what was going on. They couldn't see. It was visual privacy, but not acoustical privacy. These days, Dokusan in the West is done in such a way that it's almost like, I wouldn't call it psychotherapy, but it's very considered private and so forth. And I think in the West we overdo the privacy a bit. These questions that come up in Zen are not really personal, not so much personal as they are universal. People who are practicing Zen and dealing with this, confronting this great matter, the great matter of existence, have something in common. We're all trying to get at this, you might say, in the same way. And so this public form of Dokusan called Dharma combat, sometimes, or Mondo, crossing of swords. Hossen is another Japanese. Hossen is like extended Dharma combat. It can go on for a long time. And ceremonially, when you're on the formal practice path, if you become if you're training to become a transmitted Zen priest, you go through something called the Shuso training, where you're the head student. And at the end of your Ongo period of 3 months or 90 days, you go through something called Hossen Shiki. Hossen, again, meaning this Dharma combat. I'm not quite sure the meaning of Shiki at this in that particular term, in that particular phrase. But you sit up in front of the group, and in the week before, at least a week before, you have presented a koan from the literature of koans, of which there are 1,700 classical koans, for everybody to study. And then everybody challenges you with questions about that koan. Their questions don't have to be about the koan, but the basic idea is that they're testing your understanding. And so they just usually it's done in a very organized fashion. It goes around the around the meditation hall, around the Dharma hall, where individuals call out and say, Shuso, blah blah blah. This about what this koan. What say you? And then the Shuso has to answer, and then strikes a block with the staff and so forth. It's very formalized, but it's a way of testing that Matsuoka Roshi likened to the old show kung fu karate show and karate kung fu, based on some real history. Shaolin, there was a Shaolin temple, Shorinji in Japanese, where Bodhidharma stayed and taught the monks to fight open hand karate. People in the martial arts say they think this is really historically true. And so, throwing the spears at the guy on Kung Fu, he would knock the spears aside, right? One after the other, like so. And that was his test. It's a little bit like that, but they're verbal. So this is a proud old tradition of challenging a person who is training to become a Zen priest, and will have to therefore thereafter answer questions and be able to discourse in such a way as to not create confusion, and to hopefully clarify the Dharma for their followers and for the public. Sometimes even Master Dogen back in the 13th century would get public dialogues. Some of in the collection of the Shobo Ginzo, his famous masterwork, there's one which is called Gyoji, I think Gyoji 1 and Gyoji 2. And Gyoji means something like behavior, the dignified behavior of a Buddha. And one was given to the public, according to the story, and the second one was given to his monks, the inner circle of those monks who were practicing this way. When you read the two, you can kind of see the difference in the way he addressed the public and the way he would address his followers. Buddha's teaching are similarly characterized that way. Buddha did prosperity teachings. That is, teachings for lay practice people, which we regard ourselves as lay practice. We're not monastics. We don't pretend to be monastics. But, how husbands should treat their wives, how wives should treat their husbands, what they should do with wealth, the accumulation of wealth, etc. These are so-called prosperity teachings. But Buddhism is not a prosperity religion in the sense of some branches of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo chanting in order to achieve benefits in the secular world. Nonetheless, Buddha recognized that lay patrons, lay people with households, children, they didn't have people, they weren't sending kids to college, they didn't have cars to keep on the road, but they had a lot of the same problems that we have today as lay people. So he understood and directed his teachings to his lay followers differently than to the monks who had theoretically left all that behind and become members of the mendicant order. So in both cases, there were public forums in which the teacher, the identified teacher of the moment, in some cases Buddha, Dogen, whoever, would be put himself in a position of answering questions. And so this is a great tradition. The talk show tradition of that we see today, where there's ubiquitous everywhere. When you read the old records of the teachings from Buddha, there's typically somebody like Ananda, his one of his cousins and a disciple, who's the third patriarch in the succession. Subhuti, others would be interviewing Buddha in front of the crowd. And so, the typical talk show type of format we do today goes back 2,500 years to India. So these, we think, are not modern anomalies or modern developments. They're just typical ways of helping to facilitate the possibility of larger groups of people getting access to an individual who hopefully has something to share. So tonight we're pretending or visualizing that Matsuoka Roshi is here. I will be speaking in his behalf as his successor and taking questions from the field. We don't have an interlocutor, somebody who's going to be facilitating that. So I will facilitate that myself as if I am asking these questions or fielding these questions to present to Matsuoka Roshi. Then I will try to answer in such a way that he does. So in a little bit of a way, we're doing what Clint Eastwood did in a memorable campaign performance where he interviewed an empty chair. But we're not political. Or maybe we're political in the most radical way possible, being neither liberal nor conservative, both liberal and conservative, liberal, conservative, neither liberal, conservative, the tetralemma, all four. Right? So let's begin. Anyone who has a particular question they would like to raise, something that maybe is preying on your mind as practitioners of Zen that you never hear addressed in public, would be preferable.
There's not a lot of public information regarding the hara or tanden.
Hara, yep.
What is the significance of the hara to Zen?
Hara is a Japanese word. Hara means stomach or stomach power, this region of the body. The tanden is thought to be conceived of a point, a couple of inches down a couple of inches down from the navel, the center of our being. Hara, and there's some technical information on this you can Google online, which I won't cover. But Matsuoka Roshi said the hara is stomach power. Stomach power. He urged us in Zazen to make sure that the strength enters only the lower abdomen. He said if the strength rises to the upper abdomen, do this again and again until the strength enters only the lower abdomen. And do this again and again. What he meant was the rocking motion, the rocking back and forth, arching the small of the back until finally all the weight drops to that area like a sandal. If you think of what a sandal is, they have this ballast of sand in the bottom, and you push inflated sandal over to bop right back up in vertical position. So it's concentrating your physical attention in the pit of the stomach. Usually we think of meditation and the mind as being here in the brain. And Zen takes a contrary position. It's more a visceral kind of a focus. Where the mind actually resides is in the pit of the stomach. So meditation is often referred to as building hara, building stomach power. Another metaphor for that is samadhi. Samadhi is this term that's bandied about as if we know what we're talking about, but it generally means a kind of a balanced or centered state, concentrated state. So one metaphor that I have developed myself, visualization for this, is to think of at the tanden in the pit of the stomach, If you think in the beginning you're kind of unbalanced, you're off-centered, you're coming in from the outside world, there's a lot of distraction, confusion. And so you sit down and you're kind of like a baby sitting up for the first time, right? A baby learns to sit up and they're very unbalanced. And you see them rocking around and their legs are thrashing around and they're trying to find their balance in gravity. So it's very sketchy. It's not very confident. It's not very solid. But then after a while, you begin to settle in, and through the breathing and through just sitting still enough, long enough over time, this, I think, samadhi begins to develop. So if you think of it as the tanden is visualized as a point in the pit of the stomach, a couple inches in, a couple inches down. The point is visualized as a sphere, right? With the same dimension in all directions, meaning no dimension, right? A point is absolutely mm, on whatever axis you want, Cartesian or whatever axes you want to think of. It's same dimension in all directions, zero dimensions, just the central point, epicenter kind of thing. Then, if you think about it over time in your meditation, the way this metaphor I came up with is it begins to grow. And so then it becomes like a buckshot, right? Or a BB. Then it becomes like maybe a marble, and then it's a ping pong ball. Then it's a baseball, right? Then it's a softball, and then it's a basketball. For some of us, maybe it's a football. Maybe it's weird, but a basketball. And then it becomes a beach ball, right? And it becomes one of these like inflatables that you can get inside and run down the beach in if you've seen those. It becomes it expands as a sphere so that eventually it's bigger than you are. You are inside of it instead of it being inside of you. But its center is still here. In the martial arts, this idea is called centering. That is, your balance becomes such samadhi means balance, centered, that when you enter the ring, you're moving inside this sphere. And the theory is, Matsuoka Roshi said he was black belt in judo, and black belt. I'm not trained at all in martial arts, but he's black belt judo. He said if you have Zen, you can defeat a superior opponent, somebody who has better waza or technique. It's like a jujitsu kind of idea. You include them in your center, right? You absorb their center into yours as they come and attack you. So it's a very powerful idea, this idea of centering. And this samadhi has more than just physical connotations. It's also like charisma. If you're very much comfortable in your own skin and you have come to this kind of spiritual confidence, as Matsuoka Roshi called it, then in public speaking or working with a group or sitting in a boardroom or whatever, you have this confidence that kind of exudes charisma. And it can be used for nefarious purposes and not necessarily a good thing. It can be a good thing, bad thing, right? But it's considered kind of a natural outgrowth of meditation. That this samadhi grows and grows and grows until you have this kind of you're sort of living in a bubble, but it's a bubble in the positive sense. That makes sense?
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you about history.
Say it again.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit
Good.
From the theoretical to sort of your experience of the history of Zen in America. It's something I'm curious about and I think about a lot. Matsuoka Roshi taught in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And this is a really heady time for American religion. It's a time with a real reputation. It's when you think of 70s religion, you think of Hare Krishna and transcendental meditation and all sorts of things. There's a lot going on.
The Beatles ring Maharishi, over.
And you think of some shady figures. I'm not going to name any names, but there was a lot of that. And I want to know how Matsuoka Roshi sort of navigated those waters and how he sort of mentored people and how your own experience of that, of sort of mentoring
Yeah.
people through the turbulent times of 70s religiosity.
He had a pretty lighthearted perspective on it. When I first met him, a drummer friend of my brother was a jazz pianist in Chicago, and I knew a lot of musicians through him. And I was teaching at the University of Illinois and the School of the Art Institute. And I had a lot of students coming in on LSD trips and coming down from LSD trips and things of that nature. I experimented with the LSD and the psilocybin, the mushrooms, all of my colleagues, friends, and people were experimenting with those. I personally came to the conclusion that I'd reached the limit of what the drugs could do. They can take you to the edge of the cliff, is the way I thought about it, but they can't make you jump over. When I first got into Zen, I began to realize Zen was where you could jump off the cliff, right? And the metaphor of climbing the 100-foot pole, Matsuoka would say, one more step. You're perched on the top of a 100-foot pole, very precarious, right? Position, one more step. So he was pretty lighthearted about that. I mentioned LSD to him one day, and he said, "Well, maybe you'll be my LSD master, and I'll be your Zen master." You know, they kind of made a joke of it. But a lot of the Zen teachers at that time were very, what would you call it? Very sort of, I wouldn't say political about it, but one was quoted saying he would burn the temple down if he found people were taking drugs or smoking dope or whatever, kind of extreme positions. Sensei was more agnostic and liberal. As far as I know, he never took any drugs. But I, at that same time, had met Baba Ram Das or Richard Alpert and invited him to the University of Illinois, and he gave this long talk about his trip to India and the guru taking the 5 hits of LSD and nothing happened, right? So I was kind of in the midst of that whole thing. And Sensei's attitude, as I said, was pretty open about it, pretty lighthearted. He gave a talk called LSD and Zen at the YMCA. And I know he gave this talk because I was there and answered questions. He liked me to go along with him and answer questions that the American audience would ask. But we haven't found a copy of that talk anywhere. It's got to be somewhere. Somebody's probably got a copy of it. Plus he write them all out and read them carefully. But so taking me back to your question, I got gone a little bit afield.
Yes, so I'm curious how he sort of mentored people through the experience of I don't know. I know in the 70s there was a lot of like cults and a lot of people sort of getting shepherded into the more dangerous aspects of the sort of New Age spiritualism and you think of Osho and I wonder how he sort of mentored people.
Well, we had a lot of people coming to the Zen Center at that time in Chicago who were coming down from this LSD experience, or they're coming in from that, or these psychedelics, and they somehow suspected, probably because of the work of Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, that this had something to do with Zen. Somehow Zen would know something about what this is about. And if you think about it, schizophrenia, those kinds of experiences on the psychotropic and psychedelic drugs, you didn't have anybody you could talk to about that. I mean, my students could talk to me about it at the university, but you couldn't talk to your parents about that. You couldn't talk, people were very fear-based. And unfortunately, mostly I think the trajectory that Timothy Leary took around tune in, tune out, drop out, I can't remember what it was exactly, politicized the whole thing. He didn't politicize it, but the politicians jumped on it and politicized it. And so the serious research that had been going on at the time got squelched. And now it's just beginning to experience a renaissance. There's a lot more serious research coming back around those drugs. And I witnessed in several personal anecdotes friends of mine who were students at the Institute of Design, uh, stone alcoholic, completely unable to drink and not fall apart, taking peyote, they were fine. So I could see very positive potential for it under controlled conditions, and it was unfortunate. It was a shame that it became politicized and became legalized and all of that kind of nightmare around it. And meanwhile, alcohol, which is terribly much more damaging in many ways, and tobacco for that matter, were not. So Matsuoka Roshi, he couldn't understand why people would smoke tobacco. There's a Japanese slang, it's puka puka. Puka puka means smoking. And my wife was a smoker. And I developed a fond nickname for her, puka puka. I call her puka puka. And it didn't even occur to me that that's where it came from until much later. And I realized, oh my God, that comes from smoking, Meanwhile, she had long since quit smoking. But so Sensei, I would say, absorbed this. He would say, Zen is round and rolling, slippery and slick. You can't get your arms around it. So I think he absorbed the impact of all of that stuff just as he had done everything else. It was not a divisive or major issue for him. His talk at the YMCA, he said, you cannot really deny the similarities between the experiences people are describing from these psychedelic drug experiences and the experiences we have from Kensho, or insight, seeing into the nature. And so, but he said, we don't recommend drugs. He said, if you take drugs, something may happen before you're prepared for it. He said, if you do Zen, you'll be prepared for it, whatever happens. So he wasn't denying that the two were totally contrary, opposite. He was sort of along the same lines. The theory in those days was that the psychedelics, one of the theories, the brain is primarily a filtering mechanism, filtering out experience. And as Buddhists claim to have said, the mind imposes a false stillness on reality. This is another way of saying the same thing. The mind, the brain is filtering everything to keep it under control and for survival purposes. So when you took the drugs, those filters were shut down. It didn't add anything chemically. It shut those filters down, and all of a sudden you had this, what Freud called the baby in the crib has like, what's it called? What was the expression? It was like, complete unfiltered information, where it's all just one field of energy and you can't separate mom out from the background. So the idea was that the drugs that's what they were doing. They were shutting down the natural survival-oriented functioning of the brain so that you suddenly were overwhelmed with this surge of sense data that is not filtered, not organized, not categorized. So in that way, the effects of the drugs are very similar to what we think are the effects of meditation. If you push the envelope enough, eventually you break through that conditioning or that false stillness that is imposed upon your consciousness. So all in all, I think he had a very balanced approach to that phenomenon. And he would be in favor of the scientific investigation of it, more than anything else, not a fear-based political reaction to it. Make sense?
Time for one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question.
Let's let somebody else if they have something.
Well, so since it's been asked whether the Buddha had whether a dog whether a dog has a Buddha nature. So I ask you, does the Buddha have a dog nature?
Well, there's no such thing as the Buddha.
A Buddha. Buddha.
Buddha has all kind of dog, chicken, cat, cow nature. Buddha's unrestricted nature.
I wanted to ask you, what would Matsuoka Roshi ask you?
What would he ask me?
Yeah. And what would your answer be?
That's a pretty interesting question there. He had.
We're going to have to tune in next week. No, I'm kidding. That's a good one.
He would say one of his favorite phrases was "nara hodo." Oh, nara hodo. That means, is that so? Is that so? So that's probably what he'd say. Nara hodo. Is that so? Whatever you say, whatever I would say, oh, nara hodo. And this goes back to in one of his stories he recalls in his collected talks, which you can read about, was Hakuin Zenji, I believe it was accused by a young woman in the village of having gotten her pregnant. And so she and her parents come to his hut one day and bring the baby. And you hear the father of this baby. And he says, is that so? I guess he says, not a hodo. He takes the baby, right? Then he raises the baby. He goes for a while. He goes into the village and he tries to collect milk and money and stuff to raise the baby. Doesn't question this at all. And all the villagers are turning against him because, this is a betrayal. I mean, they thought he was this saint or type person or whatever. And so this goes on for some time. I don't know how long. You can read this story in Matsuoka Roshi's teachings. It's also in Trevor Leggett's Zen Readers. And one day the young woman comes back and she's crying and confessing that he wasn't the father at all. It was this young boy in the village. Right? And he says, not a hodo, hands the baby over. Is that so? So that was Sensei's basic question. Right on the money.
Good night.
Good night to all, and join us again. Please look for us on Mixlr, Facebook. Where else? Very good questions.
Yeah, I wanted to give the last question to Matsuoka.
Yeah, that's very good. I'm glad you did. That's one he would ask.